Lefebvre's group from the psychology department.
Hi everybody, I'm Alex King. This is Rachel Shinnick, Madison Krafft, Jojo Franklin, Mcleod Dean, and Logan Brown. And our study was on the manipulation of self-discrepancy on the experience of acute pain.
So what is self-discrepancy? People in general are motivated to achieve their goals, and when there's a difference between who you are now and who you should or who you would like to be, then there's going to be a motivation to close that gap. There's 3 states of the self: the actual self, who you are now; the ideal self, who you desire to be, so for example, most people would desire to be happier; and the ought self, who you feel you should be or who you feel it's your obligation to be. So some people may feel an obligation to be wealthier. So there's 2 types of self-discrepancy: actual ideal and actual ought. And the actual self is the reference point for this theory. So when you're looking at discrepancies within a person's personality, you're always going to compare the ideal and ought self back to the actual self to determine if there is a discrepant characteristic. So when a person feels that there's a difference between who they are now and who they should be, they're going to experience discomfort. And this discomfort manifests in the form of dejection-related emotions like depression for actual ideal, and agitation-related emotions like anxiety for actual ought. So how does this relate to pain? A study done by Waters, Keefe, and Strawman in 2004 examined the relationship between self-discrepancy and patients with chronic lower back pain without manipulating any variables. And what they found was that when there was a greater actual ought discrepancy in a participant, that was correlated with a self-reported, more intense pain. And when there was a greater actual ideal discrepancy in an individual, that was correlated with increased depression levels and increased psychological distress levels. Another study done by Waters and colleagues in 2015 targeted self-discrepancies using therapy, and they found that when therapy was used to target these discrepancies, there was a decrease in depressive symptomatology and a decrease in overall self-discrepancies. So these studies provide evidence of the relationship between chronic pain and self-discrepancy, but what we wanted to look at was the relationship between acute pain and self-discrepancy, and that's what we did this semester.
So the purpose of our study was to assess whether the priming of self-discrepancy would have an effect on the experience of noxious stimuli. We had 3 hypotheses within our study that all stated that priming of self-discrepancy would have an effect on mood, such that we would see an increase in negative mood, that there would be an effect on the experience of pain in the actual ideal and actual ought groups, and that the priming of self-discrepancy would lead to a change in the worry about pain.
So we were able to conduct our study with the help of 39 Wofford students. 11 were males and 28 were females. So we used the CELS questionnaire, and this is a questionnaire developed by Higgins and colleagues, and it allowed us to examine the possible self-discrepancies within our participants. So we asked them to list up to 10 words that describe their actual ought and ideal selves, and then we asked them to rate the word's intensity on a scale of 1 to 4, and this was a pre-assessment measure. We then used the mood affect scale by Strawman and colleagues, and this allowed us to assess positive and negative moods for both pre- and post-assessment, and this scale involved 24 words in which our participants used a 7-point scale to rate. So we also used the For Journey Barber device, which is this right here, what you're seeing. And this device has a plastic dull edge, like right here. I guess you can see it right here. But basically, we used 4 indistinguishable weights that ranged from light to extra heavy, and we placed them on the lever right there on our participants' fingers, and this allowed us to induce acute pain. And then we used the electronic visual analog scale, also known as the EVAS, to measure pain and worry about pain, and this was done on a scale of 0 to 100. And then we had a priming questionnaire. So this priming questionnaire was pretty much just a form that we created to manipulate self-discrepancy in our participants. So we had each individualized priming form was made for each participant based on their discrepant word, and we wanted to emphasize their discrepant word. So, for example, if the discrepant word for someone was smart, the priming form would ask questions like, why do you feel it is important to be smart? And this, like I said, was just to induce to manipulate self-discrepancy for our participants.
So for the procedure, we initially asked them to sign a consent form, and then we sent them the SELS questionnaire electronically. After they completed the SELS questionnaire, we were able to assign them to one of three conditions. This was a random assignment. They were either assigned to actual ideal discrepant, actual ought discrepant, or the neutral discrepancy. After we assigned these conditions, we were able to create the priming form, which if individuals or participants were in either actual ideal or actual ought, we looked on their list to find the highest rated discrepant word for ideal or ought for their respective conditions, and for neutral, it was a random word that was not present on any three of their lists. And after this, we then asked them to come in and complete the experiment. We initially gave them the baseline where we gave them a mood survey. We ran them through 24 trials using the Borgione Barber device, which varied the weights and the fingers, and this was in a preset order. And then after we gave them the initial assessment, we gave them the priming form, which was supposed to manipulate the self-discrepancy. After this manipulation, we then gave them another mood survey and then ran them through another 24 trials, which was just in a different order in comparison to the previous one. So previously, we had hypothesized that the negative mood or negative affect ratings would increase with the manipulation of self-discrepancy, but we found that it had no sort of effect whatsoever on the positive affect or positive mood, and it actually had the reverse effect of what we hypothesized, with the negative mood or negative affect decreasing in comparison to how we hypothesized that it would increase.
So one of the major variables in this experiment was pain, and seeing if priming self-discrepancy had an effect on it. We predicted the actual ought and actual ideal conditions would have an effect on pain. Therefore, there should be an increase between the pre and post assessment for both conditions. Based off of the graphs, as the weights increased, participants did report more pain, but there was no significant differences between the conditions and the assessment periods. One other major variable in the experiment was the level of worry in participants, and seeing if priming self-discrepancy had an effect on it. Again, we predicted actual ought and actual ideal conditions would have an effect on the level of worry. Thus, there should have been an increase between pre and post-assessment period. However, as displayed on the graphs, as the weights increased, so did the participants' level of worry, but again, there was no significant difference between the conditions and the assessment periods.
In summary, our experiment focused on manipulating self-discrepancy with acute pain. We did not find significant evidence for the priming of self-discrepancy and how it affects mood, pain, and worry. One limitation why we did not find significant results could have been that we used a self-report assessment instead of like an observational report. And this could have been an issue because sometimes on the SELS questionnaire they did not fill out all 10 words, and when they did, the odd and ideal words were independent of each other, which didn't leave much room for discrepancy. And then another issue we had was where we used acute pain rather instead of chronic pain, which we saw in previous studies that did have an effect on self-discrepancy, but because both of them occur long-term, whereas acute pain only occurs short-term. For future directions, we thought it might be easy, as I said before, to use observational reports, such as from the experimenter themselves or from peers and family members, such as your parents probably think you're a different way than your friends think you are, which kind of could help the discrepancies in a way. And this can also help increase and highlight the discrepancies. And then finally, Alex would like to intensify the acute pain by electric shock. But we don't believe that would be possible, so Alex here wants you to do an experiment again. Ask more questions.
So, I mean, what you did sounds absolutely reasonable and of course based on prior research. Do you think that they actually felt the discrepancy? Even though it was based on what they said, do you think you induced discrepancy in them?
So based on our results, we think that we did not induce the discrepancy enough, that they would have been able to tell that we were priming them for a discrepancy. So in the future, like she said, with the future directions, we would want to somehow use a different assessment tool possibly that would maybe increase them being induced by this discrepancy so that it would potentially have a greater effect on when they experience pain.
I don't know if you asked this, but could you ask a question like, in what way do you think you're not living up to your ideal of being smart? How does it make you feel that you're not living up? I mean, you could make it a lot tougher.
Yeah, so our
Without
priming,
shocking.
our priming form had four different questions that kind of varied in the level of asking, do you feel you're living up to this? Do you think it's important to be this?
Yeah, and like, do your parents think it'd be important to be this?
Any other questions?
All right, thank you.